Welcome back. And sorry, Judith, we're running a little bit late. But I'll hand over to you and looking forward to this update. So kia ora, Judith.
Tēnā koutou katoa, and thanks for having us along today to provide this update around biodiversity delivery within our operations group. I just want to, for the benefit of, this is live stream, so I'm Judith Goulet in the role of General Manager Catchment Implementation, having oversight of our biodiversity and biosecurity section in water and land. One of the things you'll pick up today through this presentation is that biodiversity is delivered in a lot other areas than just that. So that's one of the things we're just wanting to emphasise. I have Carl Diamond online. He's based currently down in the Timaru office. So Carl is our manager for biodiversity and biosecurity team as well. So a lot of the work that is delivered is under his leadership as well. Going to fail at the first hurdle of pressing a button. Apologies. So one of the reasons of being here today is to provide you with an overview of the biodiversity mahi delivered within operations in a way that's been developed to understand the range of work we undertake and how that is reflected across the operational business, and in turn reflected in the core services of environmental regulation, protection and community, I always get that one mixed up, community hazards, resilience to hazards, community preparedness and resilience to hazards, sorry. The intention here is to help you understand where biodiversity is reflected in those services, because it's not just in one service. I feel like this is an exercise of taking something that seems really simple, biodiversity, making it complex because it's delivered in all sorts of places, and trying to reflect it simply in relation to our core services and service measures and sub-services we deliver. But actually it's still really complicated. So we'll see how we get on. And I recognise on a couple of the slides I've put some figures of values of goods and services dollars, and I suspect that might have people looking up all sorts of things. So I just want to, if I can talk through this and then come back to questions, that would be greatly appreciated. That's all right. Thank you.
Thanks, Judith.
Sorry, I should have had a co-driver. Bit of context, obviously, the roles and functions of biodiversity for Environment Canterbury are set out within the statutory responsibilities. We've got the Resource Management Act up there, but of course the Biosecurity Act does enable us to protect biodiversity outcomes as well, which is not reflected on that slide. Apologies for that. We have a range of national strategic documents in place and instruments to also inform our development, how we implement National Policy Statement for Indigenous Biodiversity and the Aotearoa New Zealand Biodiversity Strategy Te Mana o Te Taio. As we go down that graph, we come into the more regional strategic direction and frameworks that are in place. So the regional instrument being the Canterbury Regional Policy Statement, but also the Canterbury Biodiversity Strategy, and then down into both the regulatory and non-regulatory frameworks in place to help us deliver. That in that regional plan, of course, we do have mechanisms within the Canterbury Regional Pest Management Plan, not just the RMA Land and Water Regional Plan. And I think that's just an important thing to keep balanced here. Could be really easy to assume everything's delivered through the RMA. And, just to make that simple thing a bit more complex, there's a whole bunch of those that are moving. So, it's... So there's many parts of the organisation that contribute to biodiversity outcomes through the mahi we do. So it makes for a complex picture. Today we're here to discuss the on-ground delivery of work within operations. So there is a focus on the work that is investing in on-ground change, and hence some of those figures around financials are related to goods and services versus our labour. For the purpose here, we've in operations, we've captured our role as supporting and delivering biodiversity protection, enhancement and restoration. I do want to recognise that in order for us to do that, we pull across the business and we are implementing the direction of some of the business, whether that be from our planning and frameworks, but also we rely on our science colleagues, comms and engagement and everything. So I'm really conscious this is operations snapshot. So stepping back, I took a moment to reflect where within the reporting you see through the long-term plan, the quarterly reporting and the annual plan, aspects of our delivery and operations contributing to biodiversity outcomes would be reflected. So I've chosen these are the subservice measures within environmental regulation and protection in blue, and then the subservice within the community preparedness and response to hazards in the purple. You will have seen from the circulating the presentation earlier that I talk through each of these as we go. But there's a mix here of where we are, our work and mahi we deliver under these services is either specifically directed for a biodiversity outcome, and the classic one for this one would be that we partner to protect and enhance Indigenous biodiversity in Mahinga Kai. All the work delivered under there is for achieving that outcome. The other boxes is where biodiversity may be part of the outcome, but it may not be the sole part. So this is where, when you try and capture, especially a quantify that work, it becomes really complicated. So I just want to acknowledge that. I've put here on the bottom left there, we provide authorisations in line with our regulatory frameworks and management of the Canterbury environments. The reality here is, that's our consenting and authorising functions. If we don't capture and lock in the outcomes in those documents, then we're not going to be maintaining. We'll be going backwards and backwards and backwards. So it's highlighted there, but again, that's predominantly labour. So for the rest of the presentation, I don't really talk about that, but it's a really important aspect in our role in delivering biodiversity outcomes on the ground. So just stepping back then to reflect those up into the the outcome measures and the service measures that are in place within the long-term plan. For environmental regulation protection, wetlands, coastals, Indigenous vegetation, habitats, Mahinga Kai, braided rivers and pests, and then braided rivers and community preparedness resilient to hazards. And that braided river outcome is the same. We're just recognising it's delivered in both parts of the business. And then we just captured where those service measures are reflected. All of this mahi, though, helps us accelerate the regeneration of the natural environment through the work, and in doing so also we do it in a way that is empowering communities to take action. So those things go hand in hand. Obviously, there are also delivery to some of those other long-term aspirations, but when we think of a biodiversity delivery on the ground, the two with the circle are the ones that pop out. So we get to the very complex slide. That might have had lots of people thinking, and I've done a bit of reflection on presenting this, and I guess it was this intent to give visibility of where work we are delivering on the ground may be reflected in those services that perhaps hasn't been as obvious. So I'm trying to make something obvious. The figures here are all figures and relate to this year's annual plan, and they reflect things that were in place at Q2 on the balance sheet or in the books, if you like. So it's aligned to that Q2 reporting as well. So there's a lot of information in here, and I'm going to step you through each one of these in a group, so it'll take some time. The presentation does focus on GST, goods and services element being delivered and not labour. And that bottom right-hand corner in each box, as referred to in the footnote, is the ECAN rates generated portion. So it's not the full budget we have for goods and services, but it is what we gather from our community, either through general targeted rate or in the case of the purple box, the UGLC, etc. So I just want to articulate that. There's some places where it's really easy to grab a number, like on the left-hand side where it's 4.07 million. That's just all the budget in that program of work, deliberately, intentionally for the partnership, a delivery of biodiversity outcomes. where there's a bit of a squiggle, it starts to get, it's a portion of the what is in those budgets. So I just want to, hence simple becomes complex very quickly. So broadly, I mentioned we've got aspects that are quite direct benefit to biodiversity outcomes and direct delivery, and then we've got some where there is a co-benefit. So the first one, and this is the one that is obviously has been set up for the direct purpose of delivery of biodiversity outcomes. This mahi is delivered through the teams within my watch, the biodiversity officers, and also in water and land, David Pereira O'Connor's team and partnership projects. So that's where, the who's doing the work. And and today we're just focusing on some of those on-ground works where we're trying to ensure restoration efforts is focused on priority habitats and ecosystems, and we're optimising those outcomes through partnerships, collaboration, and conductivity with others. I'm going to run through some examples of the projects, but I'm just testing my animation here. I've just added onto the slide, which wouldn't have been in the pack in front of you, we have additional revenue this financial year to the value of $869,000 into this service area. Okay, this is where we've got money from other sources. The majority of that relates to a MFE Freshwater Fund grant to deliver to the Whakaora Te Waikikawai project. But it also, you might recall back in September, I think it was, we came with some additional money for a Upper Rakaia project where we'd got some grants to the value of $800,000. So I'm just highlighting there what we've gathered from the ratepayers been matched with other revenue that is sitting on our books, so that's part of that income stream. But when we go about the work, we also partner with others. So there is other benefits and leveraging funding from a landowner or another agency that doesn't actually enter our balance sheet as alternative revenue. Okay. And in the work, so a lot of this work has traditionally been what has been reported through the Biodiversity Snapshot Report. And when we do that, there's between 1/3 to 2/3 additional funding come in. Now, we've captured some of that through this very formalised grant agreements that have come into Environment Canterbury as revenue. But the other third is really around landowner contributions or other agencies. So that ends up quickly our $4.07 million of, rates generated for delivery on the ground actually ends up coming to a value of about $6.27 million. So that's just trying to capture the working with and leveraging additional outcomes. So this service, we've identified the sort of 3 general programs of work. One relates to more targeted biodiversity delivery. They tend to be quite small scale, localised, site specific. For example, there was a wetland control, weed control project in Hororata as an example. The landowner in that situation didn't give any financial contribution, but has given their time, energy and resources as part of the project. The broad-scale programs are ones that you might be a bit more familiar with some of the work you do, and these require a lot of work with other agencies. And so Weed Strike Force is one where we partner with Department of Conservation significantly around that, and this year, in fact, we're funding... Sorry. Yep.
Through this and then...
Yeah.
So I'll put you down.
Thank you.
Keep going.
So the Department of Conservation would lead a team of people who undertake the work for Weed Strike Force, which is the control of woody reeds around Te Waihora, which has had great success in reducing the weed and enhancing the habitat, including for bittern. So that's one of those examples, and it's a key stream of work for the Whakaora Te Waihora work program as well. Probably haven't got time to go through lots of examples. The next one I'll just jump to then is related to this area where we move, where the focus of the work is actually about managing the threats to biodiversity rather than biodiversity outcomes as well. So straight away, that's going to have a biodiversity benefit. And the first service relates to the ensuring compliance with the regulatory framework. But within our Canterbury Regional Pest Management Plan, there are site-led projects that are usually associated with areas where there's specific pests impacting high ecological significance or sites of value to the community. So the example, Governor's Bay, control of Old Man's Beard, is an example on this one where this year Environment Canterbury is spending $20,000. Landowners are doing their own work for smaller infestations and making contributions over time. But over the 10 years of that program, we've had significant reduction in the Old Man's Beard and in that area. So this is where the Canterbury Regional Pest Management Plan does have tools enabling it. But it's only a very small amount of the total budget for the regulatory role around the pest management. The collective efforts for preventing and reducing and eliminating pests is obviously where our wilding and conifer control and wallaby eradication programs sit. But there's also other work that happens that's probably not as high profile and definitely not as significant in financial value around biodiversity initiatives with other councils, things like biocontrol agents for managing pests, and proactive surveillance around, that we're checking when we're not getting invasions of things. So Mediterranean fanworm would be an example of, some of the surveillance work around our ports and our marine areas. I'm just going to, if I click on this, we should have, so with the wilding conifer and with that box that's got wilding conifer and wallaby eradication in there, we rate for $1.55 million to deliver that work. But obviously we've got significantly more money to help us deliver. So at the moment on our balance sheet, that's sitting at an additional $7.1 million. As of the Q2 report, but there has been since then, to council 2 papers, it's another $3.8 million. So just straight away we're into a proportion of what we rate for versus what we deliver, have money to deliver changes quite significantly. And the other aspect here in these programs, there is the intention of, to various degrees, around landowner input and contributions as well. We're nearly through these bits. We provide support for local action, and this is where our sediment, soil conservation and revegetation program sits with, which is funded with MPI. So we rate I've got approximately 150,000 in there, but we have income coming from MPI for this financial year to the value of $480,000. The SCAR program is more than planting poplar poles. A significant portion of it is about retirement and restoration of erosion-prone land, with that program being landowners, where they are retired and revegetated, also putting that land into covenants. It's been an amazing mechanism to engage with landowners and empower them to make a difference for these outcomes. So approximately 60% of the program actually delivers on that retirement and revegetation aspects. And I think that's that power of how do we enable and leverage more to get action on the ground. And then lastly, we've got the service around building and maintaining flood and river resilience. And as you'll be aware, there's been a big focus on how do we get biodiversity benefits through the work we deliver to manage for pests and hazards, flooding and hazards. So this is reflected in our regional park work, but also in the implementation of our biodiversity, braided river revival strategies. And there are specific rating district works that have activities for biodiversity benefits, such as opening for fish passage, both at Te Waihora, but also down in Wainono as well. So that's where the decision to open isn't just about drainage, but also about the opportunities to support migration. These programs also, especially the Rakahuri and Rakatata, have a high involvement from Department of Conservation in this work, as well as in those others, even in wilding, conifer program, LINS as a landowner, Department of Conservation as a landowner, individuals as well. So that's another aspect. I've just got 2 more slides to finish off here. There's underlying all of our biodiversity mahi and operations are some key priorities. These drive our targeted biodiversity work programs that delivering mahinga-kai biodiversity, but also inform all the other initiatives that I've spoken about where biodiversity is a co-benefit. The first of these is set out as in the CBS that it makes good financial acumen to protect first. That is the most cost-effective way to ensure biodiversity value because it costs a lot to restore or recreate ecosystems that are lost. Where we work is driven out of the priority areas from the Canterbury Biodiversity Strategy and Regional Policy Statement. And are done in a way of being focused on where do we accelerate the regeneration of natural environment. The focus in the long-term plan has been on freshwater, both braided river and wetland, and coastal environments, be that estuaries and hapua as well. And then how we work becomes really important, and I think this is where the secret sauce becomes a factor in how we deliver, of the leveraging the value that we gather from our ratepayers to make that even more on the ground. We've got a growing relationship with mana whenua and how we deliver that work, especially in relation around mahinga-kai and important habitats, and there's work underway exploring that. And you will have heard, with some of those examples that were up there, we didn't get a chance to go into much detail, but some of those relationships are quite mature if we think of the co-governance arrangements we have in place, and in other areas they're, I guess, still growing and developing. Collaborating in partners with others to achieve more together is fundamentally important for this. And that is also about ensuring the gains on investment, because if we don't have the community, the buy-in of the broader community and the landowners, then we can invest in something and it not be resilient over time. The ability to support others to take action. So the fact that we have money available to help and support and leverage becomes an important factor. And seeking those opportunities to deliver co-benefits, but also connect our ecosystems. And when we're out and about, seeing other opportunities for delivery. A key factor on this, and because I've focused on some of the works we were delivering, goods and services delivery on the ground, none of that happens without the dedication and the passion of the people who have the conversations, give a good advice and make connections and see opportunities. So our staff across all of these sections work quite closely together. So we've got a view that work is done externally to people in the community, agencies, landowners, around advice, education and awareness of what might be possible. And then internally, the integration across the different functions around biodiversity outcomes and our role in biodiversity is really important. And Carl's done some great work pulling in, so that when we're delivering, and Greg and our rivers teams is talking with our biodiversity advisors, etc. So we've got a joined-up integrated approach occurring within the business. That's really important when it comes to giving advice on future regulatory processes and policy development, be that in an RMA land and water plan or in a Canterbury Biodiversity Strategy or future Canterbury Pest Management Plan as well. So that full cycle of feedback from on-ground delivery and operations into those frameworks becomes really important. So that's me.
Yeah, where you go, Vicky? Have you got a question?
That's okay.
Okay, well, you got a question?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay. Yeah.
So yeah, just in terms of the pest management figure that was given in the blue box. So is that saying that 400,000 of the total rates that we collect for that pest management work is targeted at biodiversity action? So I can't remember what the total budget is and what that 400 in terms of the ratio. But one of the things that I've heard repeatedly from some of the people I connect with is that there's a real emphasis on pests that are impact to productivity on land rather than for biodiversity. And I have heard that some regional councils actually distinguish between the two and make it really clear how that funding is and change where the rates come from. So they put a higher targeted rate onto landowners who are benefiting from productive pests, and then there's a general rate specifically for the biodiversity pests. And the reason why I'm interested in that is because I feel like it's much easier to argue across general rate payers to push up the funding for biodiversity pests when they can see that it's delivering on biodiversity outcomes. And I get the sense that we're really underspending on that. And obviously the wallabies is one issue, for example, where we've, and of course that's a pest that's got impacts in both places, and I know that. But yeah, so I'd just be interested to know, are you thinking about that and how the different amounts of funding and who's paying comes from, and how we might actually leverage potentially more for doing biodiversity pest management?
I mean, that's top of mind, and I think we can only reflect over the last few years around the recognition that the wallaby, traditionally in containment area, if we go back 10 years, was focused on production pest outcomes, and that transition now to the fact that there is so much value around protecting and enhancing biodiversity by controlling that browsing pest. So I think we're live on that, and that is part of the work. I don't know if Carl's got the details on hand, but there is, as we look at the regional pest management strategy as well, they're coming up for renew 2028, that, that's another factor as we look at the there's the rule framework as well to give effect to these things, but also how do we gather and spend the revenue.
Thanks, Vicky. Oh.
Sorry, yeah, and also just the weeds. Sorry, I include pests. I always think pests as being animals, but of course the weeds is the thing that's really important, isn't it?
Yeah, David, and then Claire and Dion.
Just adding to Vicky's comments there. Obviously, we have quite an issue with wilding conifers and wallabies. I see that box sort of saying we're getting 1.5 million from rating and external 7.1. But what I'm interested in really is the shortfall between what it may take to get on top of wilding conifer control, and similarly with wallaby eradication. I think as a group here, it would be helpful if we had some indication of crystal ball gazing, for want of a better word, what sort of money would be involved to actually achieve some realistic progress in those two particular areas. Wallaby eradication, I'm not sure whether we would ever get to a stage where we could say we've eradicated wallabies from New Zealand. That may be fanciful. But to get to a stage where we can manage the problem, and likewise the wilding conifers, that sort of equation I think is of interest to me and maybe interest to others. Longer term, seeing what sort of effort we may need to put into extra external funding or lobbying for funding, or alternatively even looking at our rating program to actually try and get on top of this problem. So if we could have some expanded information as to how we might get on top of these problems, I think that would be of help to us.
Thanks.
Second point, the next slide we were talking about priorities in the strategic how, and how we work. And in that first bullet point, we were talking about growing relationships with mana whenua. A great concept, but again, I would, particularly with reference to Mahinga Kai, I've never seen any data as to how, to what extent that practice is actually conducted. And we're putting, I don't see a lot of Mahinga Kai happening in my travels. And so I really want some empirical data as to what extent Mahinga Kai is features in our relationships with mana whenua. So it's a great notion that we work with mana whenua to enhance our relationships with Maori, but I personally would like to see some indication as to what extent Mahinga Kai is actually being practiced. And I think we allocate something in our annual plan like...
Okay, we're running out of time.
Yeah, right.
I think you've spoken for 4 or 5 minutes. I think the specific stuff on pests, like that's probably a whole nother briefing, so let's leave that to there. The Mahinga Kai thing, I'd love to see some bit more work done on that too, so I'm happy to have a look at that. But a lot of that data is held not by us, but by others. Catch records for customary fish and, records for recreational fishing, etc. It's a pretty blurry space, to be honest, David. But, yeah, be interesting. But remember, it's not all about taking Mahinga Kai, because some species we can't even take at the moment because they're endangered and threatened. So, yeah, it's a much broader concept than just that. So there's a lot of restoration work, protection work that goes on as well. I had Claire, have you still a question? Because we're really over time, but away you go, and then Dion.
I think it's important.
Yeah, no, for sure. Yeah.
So, yeah, look, thanks very much for the presentation. I think it's probably quite enlightening when you look at actually the operational programs work, that slide with the 4 or 5 of them together, and the amount that's and I tried to match it with our annual plan information or long-term plan information. So I acknowledge that it's probably only simple to do the one which is protect and enhance Indigenous biodiversity in Mahinga Kai. We collect something in excess of 10 million from ratepayers for that. So I'm actually quite surprised that the goods and service, or actually what we spend, is for 4.7. Judith, you also have responsibilities for land and water, which is one of our key core functions of the organisation. Perhaps more so, much more so, I would say, than perhaps the biodiversity. Do you have any idea of how much we actually spend for on-the-ground actions in our land and water space?
So part of the work we deliver in land and water is sitting in that box through partnership and co-governance. So that's the team that report to land and water. So if we're taking, so this is, are we taking the work we're doing and why we're doing it, or the how we arrange our business through a structure? We also have the most of the work delivered through our land and water team at the moment, with the exception of the partnership programs, is sitting under the early 4 E's of the we ensure compliance. So the educate, engage and enable. So that would be in that box in the middle there, around educate and engage and enable people to be doing the right thing, knowing what to do and doing the right thing. We do not have a lot of goods and services to deliver that work. But that is a space we are looking at, in the future, in a long-term plan. What do we do if we want to? If we know we can leverage good outcomes by having some money available, what does that look like going into the future? So,
if I may just add on to that, because I think it's a challenge that this council table needs to actually consider in the long-term plans. We don't have any line for collecting funds that for supporting, helping and leveraging, which you so ably have explained the benefits from that in our annual plan, long-term plans. So we've missed the boat. We've got our priorities wrong, in my opinion, particularly when we think of the catchment groups and they're just screaming out for support and some funding and some help to do that on the ground stuff, which is so good.
Yep, where you go, Judith.
Just to clarify, the soil conservation revegetation program is also delivered all through the water and land team. So just to clarify.
And I think because I've gone through my head on like, where's the CWMS 500,000 that
Not
goes?
NOPs.
It's not there. I know. And then there's other land and water stuff, the Waitaha Wai funding. Like we know, there's a lot of biodiversity outcomes through those programs. But again, it's hard to see it in one place. But I think that's the same as Claire. Be good to show that. I know it's not ops, but that's important for us to understand that it's all interconnected. So good on that. Dion, last question.
Claire's asked part of the question I wanted to answer. I'm not going to ask it again. And I support what Craig said around maybe getting something around pests specifically might be quite good, useful. There might be a bit of conversations around that, because I'd love to know how we get around that pest management strategy, how we get visibility on Canadian geese and feral cats and maybe potentially anything else. So at some stage I'd like to understand how we can feed into those processes.
And the other one that I picked up was, then there's the biodiversity strategy work that's also going on, but again, that's not ops, so it's not here. But I think that's what I think the table would be helpful to see. Okay, there's the ops programs, and then there's the other programs that relate to biodiversity. But what you've done here is really good in terms of trying to break it down and say what's got some specific outcomes from the wider budgets for biodiversity. So I think that's good. Be good to see that for those other programs as well, so we understand these interconnected work as well. But thank you, Judith. Really appreciate what you've done and what you've brought to us. The only other thing I thought was that providing advice and support, but obviously there's a labour cost to that, and that would be nice to understand that in relation to the goods and services going out the door as well. So thank you. But I think we'll end there, knowing that this is a definitely hot topic that we probably want to talk about a little bit more going forward. So thank you. And sorry, Vicky, but we need to move on, or else we're never going to finish our whole day that we've got, because we've got some really big topics today. So thank you. So if we can move straight into our next presentation, and that's on our with the wastewater performance standards from Taumata Arawai. And Tim, I know, is here. Thank you. And while they're waiting to set up, as people will know, just as a bit of a background, this is Taumata Arawai's was consulting on wastewater environmental performance standards. So this is standards for discharges from wastewater treatment plants, either to water, to land. It also includes the reuse of biosolids and then overflows, so emergency overflows and things. And there's a whole bunch of standards that have been set that would allow those activities to happen pretty much with permitted activity status. So it is quite an important concept. So hand over to you, Tim and team.
Kia ora, Craig, and yes, thank you. You've introduced it perfectly. I'll just introduce Anita Fulton on my left, who's a senior strategy advisor pulling together the submission that will go back to Taumata Arawai. And on my right, Alistair Pickin, principal implementation advisor in Water and Land. And I'm Tim Davey, Director of Science. Look, we're not going to talk for too long because we want to get feedback. But what I should say is that this is not the only opportunity for feedback. The submission will be sent around and you can provide written feedback as well. So I'm going to hand straight on to Anita, and then I'll come back at the end and give a little bit of context around the Canterbury, what it means, where our current consent sits, and some of the things that isn't quite in the presentation. So,
thanks, Tim. Thank you. Good morning. That was a good introduction, so that's taken some of the presentation. So I'm not, as Tim said, I'm not proposing to go through the full presentation. I'll just cover the first couple of slides because we really want to spend as much time as possible getting your views on this to help shape what the submission will look like. So the actual wastewater standards are still being drafted. The discussion document is seeking feedback on what the Water Services Authority, Taumata Arawai, is considering will be in the standards. So consultation closes on the 24th of April we're planning to have a draft submission to you for feedback, hopefully by the 9th of April or earlier if we can do. We've requested the submission be signed off by the chair under delegated authorities, and it's really within the time frame that we've got. It was difficult to match up meetings, committee meetings for that. We will have the final submission will be reported back to the Strategy and Policy Committee on the 14th of May. We understand from the Water Services Authority that they do want to continue to work with regional councils for technical input as they draft and finalise the submission. So there will be more opportunities for us to influence what the final product will be. And we're expecting that the standards will come into effect mid to late 2025, so this year. So they're moving quite quickly. As Chair said, there are 4 standards being proposed. And these cover areas where resource consents are commonly sought for wastewater treatment plants. So namely the discharge to water, to land, beneficial reuse of biosolids, and wastewater network overflows and bypasses of wastewater treatment plants. Standards will only apply to public wastewater networks as they come up for consent renewal. And when we say wastewater networks, we're talking about the infrastructure, the process for reticulate, treat, and discharge wastewater. I think what's important to note too is out of scope of this discussion document, but may form future standards, are things like discharge to air from wastewater treatment plants, recycled, treated wastewater for non-potable use. There's also, outside of this consultation, is contaminants of emerging concern such as PFAS and heavy metals, and on-site wastewater treatment systems and community-owned and operated schemes. So these will continue in the meantime to be regulated through the current framework. According to the Water Services Authority, the anticipated benefits of these standards are outlined here. So improved public health and environmental outcomes, discharge to land standard proposed as a viable alternative to discharge to water. Communities will have access to more thorough information, reduced costs for communities, lift in performance of existing wastewater plants that seek new consents, and ensure wastewater overflows are better understood, reported and managed. So that's what we're hoping to see. Before I hand you back to Tom, the next slides are they really provide a lot more detail about the 4 types of standards and staff views on what's been proposed. So you will have had a chance to have a look through that, hopefully, yeah. The main point is that staff generally support having a nationally consistent framework to improve wastewater discharges and their impact on public health and the environment. However, from an initial assessment, it's a reasonably quick assessment of the details in the discussion document against Schedule 5 of our Land and Water Regional Plan, and that is the mixing zones and receiving water standards, and also of some of the current consents that we have for local wastewater network plants in Canterbury. it's clear that the standards will very likely be much more lenient than what we in Canterbury already have in place. So for that reason, we would want to see the standards as a minimum standard, and that would allow for flexibility to set higher standards of treatment for site-specific reasons, and also to meet our regional plan limits. I'll hand you back to Tim to continue.
And I'll be very quick. Look, I just wanted to highlight that the approach in Canterbury around wastewater there are two kind of differences in what we've been doing. The first thing I'd just highlight is that there's been a really strong push to get wastewater discharges out of rivers and onto discharge to land. And in fact, Alistair just gave me a quick stat, which is that we've got 46 wastewater plants around Canterbury that are discharging, and only one of them is discharging, in this case, to a drain, and it's a very small one. It's in Harden, to a drain that then goes into a river. The remainder either go to ocean or to land. So there has been a really strong move away from discharges to streams. The second thing is that in consenting and thinking about wastewater plants, the approach that we've taken, as have many regional councils, is to focus on the receiving environment rather than the end of pipe standard. And this is about an end of pipe standard. So yes, it is higher standards for more sensitive environments, but the approach that we've taken has been much more so about what's the receiving environment, and even down to the consent conditions. So if I gave an example of the Twizel sewage treatment works, which discharges to land, and it has virtually no consent conditions around the end of pipe. It's all about what's the impact on the environment and the local groundwater. And then just to give a couple of examples, if we look at the ocean outfall, when we talked about, and Anita mentioned that we think that the standards are quite low. If we take the Christchurch example, and it's quite difficult to do a direct comparison because they use slightly different measures and things like that. But Christchurch, which as we know is an open ocean outfall, it talks about 75% of the samples have to be less than 1,000 CFU, as it's referring to, which is the coliform forming unit. So 75% less than 1,000, and 25%, no more than 25% greater than 5,000 coliform CFU. The wastewater standard is that 90% less than 40,000, so almost an order of magnitude more, would be allowable. So it is a considerably more permissive than the standards that we have through our consents. And then if I just took one other example, which is the one that goes to freshwater, I talked about Harden, this very small scheme that has a BOD 5, as it's referred to, biochemical oxygen demand, and then it says that it would never be above 2 grams per metre cubed. And for a small, what's in these standards here is that the annual median would not be above 10 grams per metre cubed, so a lot more relaxed. So that just gives some context.
Thanks, Tim. And look, for people that have had a look at this, and I do encourage you to have a look at it, the tables are in the discussion document, the 7 categories that they set out, and then those sort of key standards, nitrogen, phosphorus and or phosphate, and E. coli, and these others in there as well. And just look at those numbers and think about what said about the Christchurch Ocean outfall current standards, and of course Schedule 5, as Anita said, in our land and water plan, and some of the standards that we're expecting in the receiving environment. That's where I've focused my information, but I'm sure we're going to articulate some of those things in our submission down to that level of data, because that's the main message that I picked up when it was presented to Uru Kahika, but also now hearing that from you, Tim, about just the Christchurch Ocean Outfall example, that there's quite a difference between the numbers that are proposed in the standard being a lot higher, and the numbers that we've consented and or are in our land and water plan. So I think that's a pretty key message that we need to send with our submission, that's got some potential issues for the receiving environments that especially our local communities may expect need to be protected. So, okay, let's go to questions. Sorry, you got Genevieve and Vicky, and then we'll go Peter.
No, thanks for that. And Craig's just covered a bit of what I was going to say. Considering there's a really strong push to get the discharges out of rivers and, more onto land, is this a negative opportunity or a risk for more coastal discharges to occur, or at least land within a coastal environment? Should we be worried, considering,
it's a difficult question to answer, really, because it depends on the circumstances. I mean, if you take Christchurch, there is very little land available for what would be a huge discharge to land. So it is. I don't know that it would necessarily. In fact, in some ways, one of the things that is aimed is to try and push it more towards land out of rivers, but whether it would push it into coastal, it's difficult to say. Just emphasising that this is treated waste; it's not just raw waste. But
I think, from what I've said, I think across the board, all the different 7 water bodies that they've looked at and the different numbers for the different water bodies, so lakes, rivers, ocean, and there's a few in between, of course, because they have high sensitivity rivers and low sensitivity rivers. That's why there's 7 categories. I think across the board, it would make it easier for any of their options, to be honest. So that's the way the standard is written. But because they potentially are permitted activities, that's just the way I'd understand it. If they meet a standard, then it's easier across the board. So it could enhance people going back to putting them in rivers if it's cheaper than doing it another way. That's what it could do. I'm not saying it will. But that's what I think the standard looks like. But I think it's all depend on where the numbers land, and I think that's the important role we have to play by informing that with the numbers that we currently consent and that are in our plan. I think that's a pretty safe area for us to be in, to say, well, they need to line up a little bit more with what's actually happening right now. That's what I suggest.
Just
Vicky?
One other thing I'd just add to that is, in terms of a permitted activity, is yes, sort of, and it's a tricky thing because we would still have to be consenting for things like air, discharge to air for odour, and some of the other things like heavy metals or anything like that. So, and this is one of the complications that we're trying to work out, is what does a almost dual consenting system look like?
Vicky?
Yeah, I was gonna like to ask about and perhaps it's the dual consenting bit, because the things like biological oxygen demand, E. coli, they're indicators. They're not getting down into the specifics of all the things that are in wastewater, and I'm thinking particularly around viruses, the bioaccumulating contaminants, pharmaceuticals, which we're becoming more and more aware of how much of those. So, I mean, if we're saying you can have, say, 10 times more E. coli, does that give a reasonable indication of how much more of those other contaminants might also be present in that water? And has there the risk and is there a model assessment as to what the implications of that could be? And do we actually know enough to know the implications of that as well?
That is a difficult question to answer. I mean, the more treatment you do, the more likely you'll pick up some of these things, but not all of them. So pharmaceuticals are a really difficult thing that often aren't picked up through more and more treatment. It can be, but it requires a really high level of treatment. But the fundamental principle is the lower the CFUs and the lower the biochemical oxygen demand, then there will be less impact on the environment. So it is a reasonable thing to assume. And that was the other thing I didn't say, is that, you know, our consent conditions cover a lot more than just the 4 or 5 that are in here. You know, they do cover the heavy metals, and there's all sorts of biological monitoring and things that goes with, for example, the Christchurch one.
And so we will or won't still have the opportunity to set those, because those would potentially also work in reverse, presumably, where if we're able to set tighter limit, or the, you know, reasonable limits on those other things, then it would automatically likely draw down what would actually end up at the outfall, even though the limits might be set as being allowed to be higher.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I think this comes back to the consenting process. It's not absolutely clear how, in this document, how that would work. There's lots of aspirations for the standards to drive efficiencies through the consent process, but you know, if we want to consent those other contaminants, then it says we follow the standard RMA process. But it's not quite clear how that works. I sense that they don't really want you to go there, but I might be wrong. And I think
I'm assuming that's going to be part of our submission then, that
Yes.
we're going to highlight this as an issue around how heavy metals and other things are consented if they're not in the standard. So, yeah.
And the other brief point I just wanted to make, which I picked up from some of our consents, was that even our discharges to land like Rolleston Pines will require UV treatment on the effluent before it's discharged to land, so that will be removing pathogens as well.
Thank you. Sorry, Peter.
A pretty simple inquiry, really, Tim. Is this motivated by cost, do you think? Change in standard? So that's one thing.
Yes, it is. Yep, that's the major driver, is simplification, and therefore cost to communities.
So the second thing is about, if that is the case, then the health implications must be reasonable in terms of lowering a standard. The implications to the health of the country must be more risky, if you like.
I think that's a fair assessment. Yep.
On the slide in front of us, that's the stated aims of the of the discussion document. So cost is definitely there, reduced cost to communities, because it is, you know, we do know that it is complex and it is costly for wastewater treatment plants, but there's a reason for that, because it does cause some pretty big issues for human health, but also environmental, ecological health. So yeah.
But my point is that where we sit right in the middle of this city, the point that you made, there's no land. So, you know.
Yeah, in some places, yeah. Claire, have you got a question?
Yeah, just question or comment. I'm not quite sure. I mean, I've read the discussion document, and I mean, to me, it's quite clear that we're still going to require resource consents, as you say. But this is trying to simplify some of the conditions, I guess, which has been talked about in other places in the RMA review about getting standard conditions on different activities. So I think that's quite a good thing. I mean, I think what concerns me is how having the one size fits all, because that's still what it is to a degree, whether you're putting a small system into a river versus a larger one into the same river. It doesn't matter, you're still expecting. So that makes it quite expensive for some of our TAs that have got the small villages that you've quoted. So I'm not quite sure how we best approach it, but also the question I do have is, were we involved, because it suggests that they've talked to a lot of people and got technical information and spoken to various stakeholders and regional councils and TAs around this. Were we involved?
There was Te Uru Kaheke, so the regional councils were involved in a working group that set this. I know several of the people who are involved in that. They were involved. They did feel a little bit like they were it wasn't a huge. Their influence wasn't perhaps as much as they would have hoped, but they were involved.
And Claire, I think you're right. I mean, the opportunity here to simplify it and all that, I think that's really good. I just think it's about getting those numbers right as well, and or like staff suggested, making them a minimum standard, so there's still some scope at a local level to work that through. So I think that's the trick here. Like, I agree, it's actually a good process to go through to come up with some standards. It's just getting the numbers and all that right that match the receiving environment stuff as well, which is what the approach that Tim said. That's sort of how we do it, rather than the end of pipe, because that's what the standard's focused on. Yeah. Yep, Tim.
So, I was just going to say one other really quick thing about that receiving environment. There's actually two aspects to it. There's the kind of the environment and the impact on the environment, but there's actually an equity issue as well around nitrogen. And for example, in the Upper Waitaka, I talked about Twizel. The Twizel sewage treatment works has a nitrogen allocated load, because that's about saying, there are other sources of nitrogen in the catchment. We're trying to manage the whole thing. And there is a load associated to the sewage treatment work in the same way that there is to any farm or anything like that. Now, this essentially would be saying, well, Twizel could operate as up to a certain standard, and in this case, 500 kilograms nitrogen per hectare per year, which is a lot more than a lot of farms would be allowed. So, there is an equity issue in how we allocate nitrogen that comes into it. And, bear in mind that 500 thing when you think that the 190 is the synthetic nitrogen cap. So,
I think
gives you an idea.
That was actually raised at Udu Kahika as well. So the equity issue around, it's not fair if these wastewater treatment plants are treated like at a lower standard than a farmer. So I think that's a really good point to make in our submission as well. I think we're going to end it there because we're running behind time. We've got a PX, quite an important PX briefing next. So thank you very much. In terms of, have you got something else you wanted to say, Anita?
I was just going to say that if you have further feedback, we would definitely want to receive that. And I guess if that can be emailed either to myself or through the governance, that'd be great.
Yeah, I think it's because it's a really technical space. I think the draft submission is really critical to just get to us so that the councillors can make feedback on that draft submission. I think what we've all read, what's in the slides, they seem like a good indication of where to head, and the things we've just discussed, I think. So go for it because it's really technical. So have a good go at that. Thank you.
Great.
Cheers.
Thanks.